Hello and welcome into the FanDuel Hurry Up. I'm Maria Marino for Fantasy Sports Network. And Number Fire's Jim Sonis is on hand to preview the Pro Bowl slate on FanDuel in the NFL. That's right, the Pro Bowl is at 3 o'clock Eastern on Sunday. And with this special slate, Jim has a handful of different strategies that he recommends you use, starting with your MVP spot in this slate, in this format. And he suggests using a wide receiver or a tight end there. Jim, why don't you elaborate?
Yeah, it's kind of weird. The Pro Bowl is so radically different than every other slate we have the entire year because generally, if we're filling out a single game roster, we want to have either a quarterback or a running back in our MVP slot because those are the two most predictable positions. But for the Pro Bowl, it has different rules. Basically, they're required to have one tight end and one running back on the field at all times. And for the tight ends, there are only two tight ends on the entire roster. So if they're required to have at least one tight end on the field, that means we can reasonably expect the tight ends to play around half the snaps or so. And that's higher than what you'd see at running back, where it's about 33% of the snaps, and at quarterback, where it's the same thing. So I just kind of want to use players who will be on the field more often. We look back at past Pro Bowls, looking specifically at the past 5 Pro Bowls, the highest scoring player from a FanDuel point perspective has been a wide receiver 3 times and a tight end twice. Yes, tight ends are actually good for Pro Bowl DFS because, again, they're on the field just more often. So when you're looking at a single game roster for the Pro Bowl, you're essentially saying, I want to pinpoint the player I think will be the highest scoring player for this game. And for past Pro Bowls, that has always been a wide receiver or a tight end. So to me, I think when you're filling out your roster, starting off with an MVP slot, I think you just want to zero in on a wide receiver or a tight end who you think will do well in this game, plug them in, and go from there. I think in general, you just want to focus on wide receivers and tight ends here, as we'll talk about throughout this show. But it's really radically different than what we see usually, where these tight ends and wide receivers are kind of just the golden unicorns of this single game slate.
Any players you recommend, Jim?
Yeah, I think that Juju Smith-Schuster is pretty interesting if we're looking at the AFC side because Juju's always just fun. As you know, Marie, he's a super fun guy. It seems like the Pro Bowl's maybe his type of format. So I like Juju. I think he's pretty interesting, but I'm also not opposed to George Kittle, who we'll talk about tomorrow when we do the full player discussions. If you want to go tight end, Kittle getting good quarterback play here in the Pro Bowl. We know what he can do after the catch. So I think Juju and George Kittle are two interesting names I want to keep an eye on here.
Juju, throughout this season, was targeted 166 times. Pretty wild. Look to him to be even more active come Pro Bowl time. All right, so another strategy that Jim likes for Pro Bowl DFS, targeting wide receivers specifically for floor. Why don't you explain what you mean by that, Jim?
Yeah, a part of it does revolve around what we discussed at the top there, where they're just going to be on the field more because a lot of times you'll see 3 wide receivers in the field and there are only 4 wide receivers on each roster, which means they're going to play more snaps, which does lead to a really good floor. But also, just from a raw scoring perspective, wide receivers have been good, especially when compared to quarterbacks and running backs. Over the past 5 Pro Bowls, there have been 38 total players who have scored double-digit FanDuel points in those Pro Bowls, and 15 of them have been wide receivers, 10 have been tight ends. So in general, if you want a player to get you double-digit points, your best bet is going to be a wide receiver. There have been only 7 quarterbacks who have had double-digit points in this 5-game sample, and only 6 running backs. So in general, if you want a good floor, you want to go to your wide receivers and towards your tight ends. So I think when I'm filling out a roster, to me that says I'm really okay with only using wide receivers and tight ends. Like if I fill out a lineup where it's 3 wide receivers and 2 tight ends, I'm going to feel pretty good about it. So for me personally, I think that I do want to shoot for the floor there. Guys like Adam Thielen, who have some skill, have had some time off since their most recent game too. I think that they're the guys I'll focus on most when I'm trying to identify players who have a good floor for this format.
Sounds good. And you mentioned Adam Thielen by way of example. He had over 1,300 yards this past season, which really was a breakout year for him and should be a good opportunity for him to sort of celebrate that come Sunday. Up next, using multiple tight ends. Jim, we've already discussed how valuable tight ends are when it comes to Pro Bowl DFS, and you're telling us we need more than one.
Yeah, I think when you look at those initial numbers, Maria, you could say, okay, cool. I can actually, go with a tight end here. You're not required to use any position at all with this single game format. So you could say, I don't want to use a tight end at all. Like you could hypothetically do that. But if you look at what's been successful in the past for Pro Bowl slates, using a tight end has basically been a requirement to have success. What I did was looked at the past 5 Pro Bowls, looked at the 5 highest scoring players for each of those Pro Bowls and saw what position they play. In all 5 of those games, 2 of the top 5 highest scorers played tight end. If we look at the past 2 years, there have been 2 tight ends and 3 wide receivers in both. So for the past 2 years, there's been neither a quarterback nor a running back among the top 5 scorers in the Pro Bowl. So to me, that says I do want to lock in 2 tight ends for my roster. They've also got a bit of upside because if we look at those that 5-game sample once again, the past 5 Pro Bowls, there have been 5 tight ends who have scored at least 15 FanDuel points, and there have been only 4 wide receivers, 2 quarterbacks, and 1 running back. So it's not just the fact that they've cracked up in the top 5 scores, but they also have a pretty good amount of upside. So, when you look at the rosters for tight ends, you see a guy like Jared Cook, and he's not necessarily going to get you super excited, but he is one of only 2 tight ends on that team alongside Eric Ebron. Maybe you could think the same thing about Austin Hooper, where I'm not really drawn towards this guy, but I think given the format of the Pro Bowl, given the way the rosters are constructed, I think it does make sense to use those guys. So you want to pair Jared Cook with Austin Hooper, pair Jared Cook with George Kittle, and make those combinations, getting those 2 tight end lineups out there, because in the past, that has been a rather fruitful strategy.
I like how you brought up Jared Cook, who at age 31 pretty much had a career year this past season in the NFL. Now, in talking about this format more, I'm getting the theme in terms of, we usually expect our quarterbacks or our pass catching running backs to be the highest producers in terms of points. And it's not that way. You mentioned wide receivers and tight ends are super valuable. And that brings me to your next strategy, which says be wary of running backs. I also wonder, Jim, is there a factor that has to do with running backs not wanting to really risk too much in this somewhat meaningless exhibition game?
You know what? I think that's going to be a big part of it, Maria. That's for sure. And honestly, who can blame them? Because if I were a running back, if I'm Zeke Elliott and I got maybe a big payday coming down the pipeline, I'm probably not going to try too hard during the Pro Bowl and risk getting injured. So I don't blame these guys. But it also just comes down to the fact that running backs just don't score a whole lot in the Pro Bowl. If you look at the past 5 Pro Bowls, only 6 running backs have scored double-digit points. Again, that's compared to 15 wide receivers and 10 tight ends. Only 1 running back has scored more than 15 points, which is fewer than we've had at any other position. So in general, the points just really aren't there for running backs. Going back to our discussion or looking at the top 5 scorers, because I think when you look at this slate, you're probably not going to use all your salary. So you can instead focus on finding the players you just think will be the highest scoring players. That hasn't generally involved running backs. Running backs have been among the top 5 scorers only twice in the past 5 years. There was 1 in 2013, 1 in 2014. There was never more than 1. So if you do decide to include a running back, I probably would not go with more than 1. They just don't have a lot of upside, and the floor is not as good as you'll find at wide receiver or tight end. So for me personally, I think that guys like Zeke Elliott are very tempting. Alvin Kamara is also very tempting because we know how talented these players are. But in general, just keep in mind that running backs in the Pro Bowl aren't going to get as much volume and they won't be on the field as much. So it's okay to be a bit cautious about using them too heavily.
Ezekiel Elliott may have led the league in rushing this season, but he's not top of mind for Jim Sannes as he puts together his Pro Bowl DFS lineup. I'm curious, Jim, if you anticipate using a running back at all. I know you said you don't have to, and you're saying it's okay for us to use maybe one, but are you specifically, Jim, are you going to use a running back?
I think I will in some lineups,
okay,
because I think that it's advantageous to do so in case one of them does go off. But like if I'm trying to, figure out on how many lineups I will use a running back, it's probably not going to be a huge number. Like for most of my lineups, Maria, I'm probably just going to use wide receivers and tight ends because, again, that's been the go-to strategy for these past 5 years. And I think if I'm looking between quarterbacks and running backs, I probably do favor quarterbacks there. So I'm going to use running backs. I want to give me some Saquon Barkley because it's fun to root for those guys. But more often than not, I'll probably be avoiding this position.
Very interesting. This is like an alternate universe. Okay. So the next strategy, if you do decide to use a running back, we know generally in fantasy, pass catching running backs are much more valuable, but you're saying for Pro Bowl DFS, it's pass catch or nothing.
It really is a must, like absolutely a must for running backs to catch passes in this game because there's just so little volume for running backs. If we look at a little volume as a rusher, I should say, because if we look back at those 6 running backs who have scored double-digit FanDuel points in the past 5 Pro Bowls, again, only 6 of them, 3 of those 6 caught a touchdown, so had a receiving touchdown. The other 3 all had at least 5 receptions, so either 5 receptions or a receiving touchdown for all 6 of those players. And again, 6 isn't a huge number to begin with, but basically the way to get there is via receiving production. There's been only one player in these past 5 Pro Bowls who has had more than 9 carries. That guy was Mark Ingram. He is also the only player who has had more than 43 rushing yards. So that's 4.3 points. And even despite that, even though Mark Ingram got 11 carries and had 72 yards rushing, he didn't score double-digit FanDuel points because he didn't do a lot as a receiver. There have only been 3 rushing touchdowns in the past 5 Pro Bowls, 2 of those by running backs, 1 of those by Cam Newton. So I think that if you're looking at running backs, you're not going to expect much production or much volume for them as rushers. If you're going to get them to succeed, it needs to be as a receiver out of the backfield. So, guys like James Conner, he did get used as a receiver this year, but it's not necessarily his biggest strength. So I think I'd be a little bit wary of guys like that. And if I do decide to go running back, I might skew more towards guys like Saquon Barkley, like Alvin Kamara, who have this just insane talent as a receiver, and skew more towards them as opposed to guys like James Conner.
Conner did have a nice year, but I agree. Saquon, Alvin Kamara, these are players who, their game is centered around also being that receiving threat. We have one more strategy to discuss, and we've already talked about that quarterbacks, again, are just not as valuable. And when you think about the Pro Bowl in general, you don't quite know what you're going to get from certain quarterbacks. They could go in for a series or 2. So you say be sparing when picking quarterbacks.
Yeah, I think that I do rank them above running backs for this Pro Bowl slate. So there is at least that. There is a one minor favor or factor in favor of quarterbacks that they're ranked above running backs. But I think still, like you said, Maria, we have to use them sparingly when we do decide to plug them in because it's not really just a super optimistic output here for quarterbacks, especially the past 2 years. Quarterback scoring has been really down in those past 2 years because the scoring in the game in general has been lower. Now, you look at the quarterbacks who are slated to play in this game. Got Aaron Rodgers, you got Big Ben, Patrick Mahomes will be there too. So there are some good names at quarterback, and I think that makes me more inclined to use them than I would have been last year. And I'm not going to overreact to the quarterbacks being excluded from the top 5 scorers the past 2 years. But overall, even when the Pro Bowl was higher scoring in previous years, quarterbacks weren't putting up a ton of points. If we look back to the previous seasons back in 2015 and 2014, there was a quarterback among the top 5 scorers in both those years, but there was only one. And there weren't any quarterbacks among the top 5 scorers in 2017, 2016, or all the way back in 2013 either. So I think that if you do, Maria, decide to go with a quarterback in your lineup, it's probably best to go with just one. Generally, in single game formats, I want both quarterbacks. Like next week, we'll talk about the Super Bowl. I probably do want to get both Tom Brady and Jared Goff in a lot of my lineups together. But I think for the Pro Bowl, you're probably not going to see more than one quarterback go off from a fantasy perspective. So I think that in the lineups where I do decide to go with the quarterback, maybe I want to get some Patrick Mahomes out there, maybe I want to get some Aaron Rodgers, it's probably going to be just that one quarterback. Then I'll focus on wide receivers and tight ends for the other 4 slots.
This is the ultimate example of game script dependent because, of course, Pro Bowl is not like any other game. Although I feel like every time I watched Patrick Mahomes, like on a drive, he ended up scoring. I know that's an exaggeration, but maybe if he does get a chance to get in there, he will get some points on the board, especially after that crushing defeat in the AFC Championship. All right, Jim Sonis of Number Fire, thanks so much for explaining this whole thing to us. Pro Bowl DFS. It's a new phenomenon for me anyway. A little bit backwards when it comes to strategies, and that's why it's so important to know going in what you're getting into. That's going to do it for that section of the FanDuel Hurry Up, but we still have a lot to get to. We're going to switch gears to the NBA. Actually, Corey Parson is going to give his picks for this evening, so don't go anywhere. Welcome back to the FanDuel Hurry Up. It's Maria Marino once again with Fantasy Sports Network. This time I'm joined by Corey Parson as we preview some NBA spreads that are going down tonight. And the first game we want to discuss, the Cavaliers are visiting the Celtics. It's a 7:30 p.m. Eastern tip, and Boston is favored by a whopping 16.5 points. But Corey, this isn't that outlandish, is it?
No, it's not that outlandish considering who their opponent is, the Cleveland Cavaliers, who one of the worst teams in the NBA, might be one of the worst teams in the NBA like ever. The thing with this is a big number. Considering the fact that Boston to be without Al Horford and Kyrie Irving tonight, I'm going to go ahead and back the Cleveland Cavaliers in this one. The Cavaliers are pretty good against the spread, especially on the road. That's because they're catching big numbers every night. This number right here is real big for a team that is going to be without Kyrie and Al Horford. Give me the Cavaliers and cross your fingers.
Interesting. I'll certainly be crossing my fingers. Like you said, the Cavs aren't good, but the Boston Celtics will be undermanned, which makes that number just seem even bigger. The next matchup we want to talk about, the Houston Rockets are visiting the New York Knicks. That's a 7:30 p.m. Eastern tip. Houston here is favored by 7. What do you think of this spread?
Yeah, the New York Knicks are in full tank mode right now. You got the Houston Rockets team coming in hot, even though they're coming off a loss against the Philadelphia 76ers. They take a short trip up the Turnpike to Madison Square Garden, where the Knicks are in full-on tank mode, as I said. I don't want to get in front of James Harden and this Rocket team right now. The number's real short with 7, even though it's on the road at Madison Square Garden. You know the fans come to Madison Square Garden to see the other team play. So James Harden to get a big ovation tonight. The fans will be cheering them on. Give me the Houston Rockets to lay that 7 against the Knicks tonight.
I got you, and I don't blame them. I kind of want to go just to see James Harden. Definitely don't see them having trouble covering that number. The next matchup on tap, how about the Orlando Magic coming to Brooklyn to take on the Nets? The Nets here are favored by 6.5 points. They've been playing really well. By the way, this one tips at 7:30 Eastern. How do you feel about it?
Yeah, this number keeps getting higher and higher. A lot of people on the the Brooklyn Nets right now.
That's right.
Getting behind that steam with the Brooklyn Nets. D'Angelo Russell playing like an all-star. Nice home court advantage, even though nobody shows up. They're playing very good basketball. This number is pretty steep, but you know what? I'm going to go ahead and lay it with the Brooklyn Nets. Last week, these two teams played in Orlando. Orlando jumped out to a 21-point lead. The Nets came back and won the game. I don't think Orlando has a chance to get that kind of lead tonight. I think Brooklyn makes light work of them. Give me the Nets.
There you go. Even though there's a little jab in there about people not showing up to Brooklyn, I think more and more people are going to be showing up, and they're in a really good place against Orlando. Up next, the Charlotte Hornets are visiting the Memphis Grizzlies. Tip-off 8 o'clock Eastern. The Grizzlies are the underdog. Hornets are favored by just 2 points, though.
Yeah, well, actually, the Hornets were the underdog coming in when this line was first dropped, but everybody hopped on the Charlotte Hornets in this one. Listen, the bottom line with the Memphis Grizzlies is talking about trading off Gasol, who may not play tonight. Mike Conley also going to be gone. So we already see what the Memphis Grizzlies are trying to do. They're in full-time tank mode also. Now, the Charlotte Hornets, on the other hand, Kemba Walker and his team fighting for a playoff spot. I think there's a team that will be in the Eastern Conference playoffs. They're playing good ball. You get Kemba down there and that crew down there in Memphis. I think it's an easy win. Give me the Charlotte Hornets and sprinkle something on the money line.
I love it. It'd be pretty cool if Charlotte was able to make it into the playoffs. They certainly have the star power advantage, especially when, as you mentioned, Memphis, their stars could be on the trading block. Moving on, the Los Angeles Clippers are in Miami playing the Heat tonight. That is a 7:30 p.m. Eastern tip. The Heat are favored by 4.5 points. What do you make of this spread?
Yeah, this is one of the tougher ones that you have on the docket tonight. Miami Heat getting their first home game after being on the road for about 4 straight. The Heat play about 500 ball at home. As a matter of fact, the Clippers play about 500 ball on the road. When you look at the Clippers, they're a team that sits in there and they fight and they grind and they struggle each and every night. So you know what? I'm going to take the Clippers to cover this number. I think Miami wins the game, but give me the Clippers to cover this number right here tonight.
Interesting. The Clippers certainly have been competitive, if not as successful in the win and loss column as they would like. So once again, Corey, a fan of the Clippers possibly covering the number. And I tend to agree. But let's move on. One more matchup to discuss for the evening. 7 o'clock Eastern tip between the Raptors and Pacers in Indiana. Interestingly, the Pacers are favored by 5.5 points. What is the status of Kawhi Leonard is really the big question.
The status of Kawhi Leonard is what the status of Kawhi Leonard is most nights. Kawhi Leonard will be out on a rest night. Nobody needs more rest in the NBA than Kawhi Leonard. Kawhi Leonard didn't play a whole season last year, and he was perfectly healthy, yet and still that was the case. Listen, the Toronto Raptors are the NBA's best road team. The Indiana Pacers, on the other hand, are notorious for laying spreads on nights when they should. But this one right here, that number is 6. One thing about the Raptors, when Kawhi does not play, they still show up. They play well without Kawhi. Give me the Raptors to cover this number in the game the Pacers win closely.
Not 1, but 2 knocks on any shot Kawhi Leonard would have in the MVP race. Resting, and the team seems to do just fine when he's out. And like you said, they are good on the road. All right, Corey Parson of Fantasy Sports Network. Thanks so much for joining me. Hey, if you want more content, just go to FanDuel.com/theduel. Click on videos. Also, subscribe to our YouTube channel at the Fantasy Sports Network. We'll see you next time on the FanDuel Hurry Up.